Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and possibly looking at other conflicts and issues around the world. So, again, welcome to the program. Now, as we continue to watch and analyze this war between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainians are now saying that essentially the entire ground forces of the Russian Federation, amounting between 400 and 460,000 troops, have now been committed to the actual war against Ukraine. So essentially the Ukrainians are saying, currently, as we speak, that the entire Russian ground forces have been committed to this operation. And the Ukrainians are also saying, because the entire Russian ground forces have been committed to this operation, to this war, that Russia does not have the capacity, the capability to attack other neighboring states. Now look, this is a political narrative. That statement is a political narrative designed to garner more support from Western nation states. They're simply saying, hey, look at what we're doing. We are creating an environment where NATO, the United States, does not have to worry about Russian aggression in other areas of the world. Now, one of those areas, specifically, probably the most, I would say, endangered area in which the Russians could make a move would be against Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Let's go over to the other map here. It tends to work a little bit better. But specifically Estonia. So the Ukrainians are saying, look, the entire Russian army essentially is tied up in Ukraine, and thus the Russians would not have the ability to launch an operation to seize control of Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. Now, I believe if the Russians did launch a military operation against the Baltic states, against, say, Estonia, I believe that Russia would go after all three. The Russians would go after both Lithuania, Latvia, and also Estonia. I don't believe you would see an operation where the Russians would just go after Estonia or areas where you have large Russian populations in northeastern Estonia near Narva and other places. I think it would be an all-encompassing operation designed to seize all three Baltic states. Now, why do I think that? Well, given what's happened with Ukraine, at this point, the Russian Federation has to see the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as an unplaceable threat. And a military operation just would not make sense going into Estonia alone. Now, the question is the entire Russian army, the entire Russian ground forces, committed to the Ukrainian operation. And that is categorically no. If you go to the start of the conflict and you look at the size and scope of the Russian military, the size of the Russian ground forces at the start of this conflict, then I would say, yes, you could say that the amount of Russian forces committed currently in 2024 is the size of the Russian ground forces back in 2022. But to say that right now, going on to 2 years of fighting, that's the entire Russian armed forces now committed to Ukraine. That's simply false. The Russian military has gotten a lot bigger over the course of the conflict, and it continues to grow. Furthermore, the Russians would not need anywhere near the size of the force construct that was used in the early stages of the Ukrainian war to conquer, seize control over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. A war between the Baltic states would be much different, would look much different than what we're seeing now in terms of the current war between Russia and Ukraine. Remember, the Baltic states have also handed over large sums of military supplies and equipment to the Ukrainians. The Baltic states are in less of a position now to defend themselves than they were at the start of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Now, the reason that is the Baltic states believe that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would immediately come to the aid of the Baltic states if there was a conflict. Now, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, or certain elements of NATO and the United States would come to the aid of the Baltic states through the use of air power. But it would be very difficult for NATO to deploy large sums of ground forces to the Baltic states to defend against an all-out Russian attack. Now, I got to tell you, if I'm wargaming this, if I'm looking at geopolitical strategy, if I am Russia, as of right now, I absolutely have a bullseye on the Baltic states. Beyond a shadow of a doubt. At some point, if I'm Russia, I now believe that, hey, I have to remove Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And now, this is from the perception of the Russian Federation. Especially if we start to see larger military buildups of NATO forces in those Baltic states. And again, the Russians go back to World War II. They go back to what happened with the German invasion of the Soviet Union back in 1941. They are looking at the prospect, not 1 year from now, not 2 years from now, but 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. What do some of these states look like? What does the political makeup of NATO look like? What does it look like? How does it act? And that's a big unknown. And I think at this point, the Russians would play it safe, meaning just eliminate what they perceive as this cancerous growth developing in the Baltic states. Now, could we see a Russian invasion of the Baltics in the near future? And when I mean the near future, 1 to 3 years. And I would say no. Now, after that 3 years, going into 2026, 2027, I think we have to reevaluate. I think we have to have a very close look at the geopolitical situation in this region. But currently, it would be very difficult for the Russians to launch a large-scale military operation against the Baltics, especially if we would see NATO and the United States immediately start to use air power both in Ukraine and in the Baltic states itself. It would become a very, very difficult conflict for the Russians. It would also become a very difficult conflict for NATO as well. But I think at this point, the end game for the Russians is to defeat the Ukrainians. And I believe right now the Russians have that 2025, 2026 war goal, war aim right now, in which we eventually see the collapse of the Ukrainian military. Now, after that, if we look and reassess the size and scope of the Russian military in the time frame of around 2025, 2026, I think the Russian military is going to look a lot different, both in doctrine and in size and capability. Furthermore, there is always the risk that we could see a conflict between China and Taiwan, and possibly North Korea getting into the conflict as well. Now, if that happens, and we see a true alliance between China and the Russian Federation against certain Western nation states, the world is going to be in serious problems. I mean, we're then looking at essentially World War III. And that risk is very, very great. It's currently, right now, in terms of where we are at in terms of global war, we have never seen the world in this kind of conflict since World War II. The current war that is taking place between Russia and Ukraine is greater in scope and intensity than both the Korean War, the Vietnam War. You would have to go back to World War II to find a war in scope and intensity that we're seeing now. And the Russians are continuing to increase this intensity. They are conducting this deep battle doctrine against the Ukrainians with the ultimate goal of collapsing the Ukrainian military. Probably with a goal of summer of 2025, in which you would see the total collapse of the Ukrainian military and the ultimate victory of the Russian Federation, possibly even threatening Kiev through a changing political environment in Ukraine. I think it would be very difficult for the Russians to militarily take Kiev, but if the political dynamic changes in Ukraine, we could see Russian tanks entering Kiev. I think right now, ultimately, the Russian war goal, what the Russians would like to do, is eventually cause the collapse of the Ukrainian military and seize all territory east of the Dnieper River. We understand right now the Russians could be preparing for large-scale offensive operations against Kharkov. Now, the Russians would have to envelop Kharkov, and then ultimately would the Ukrainians in Kharkiv declare it as an open city and not want to risk it looking like Bakhmut or Mariupol. I think that's what the Ukrainians have to ask themselves. If the Russians do mount large-scale offensive operations towards Kharkov, and look to envelop the city eventually, would the Ukrainians risk its destruction? Or would they declare it an open city and allow the Russians in? So I'm sure we're going to get some great comments in the comment section. Obviously, let loose, let's talk, let's have a discussion, and more to come. Thanks for joining us. And as always, have a good day.